Today on the Razzball Fantasy Show, we're going to talk about the NFL draft with a fantasy focus. We're talking about where the big fantasy rookies are going, who's going to take them where we want them to end up, and what we should expect, plus what impact is that going to have on their existing fantasy players. And today, I'm joined by someone else. It's not just me for an hour. I'm joined by Jeff. Jeff, what's the most exciting thing coming into the NFL draft for you? What are you looking forward to in this draft season?
I'm most excited actually for the Chargers and that 5th pick. I think they can go so many different ways, and what they do will make a huge impact on the other teams after them, and that's where the trading is going to start happening. I think it's around after the Chargers.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the first 3 picks we can feel pretty good, and then it gets really interesting once we start thinking, does someone trade up with the Cardinals? Does someone trade up with the Chargers? If they trade up with the Cardinals, what do the Chargers do? Do they take an O-lineman? Do they take a wide receiver? Then it gets really messy, and there's a really messy area around 4 to 6 where we just don't know what's going to happen. I think that makes life really interesting for us. And that's why this year's draft is one of those ones where you really don't know what's happening. I mean, we didn't even know who's going second pick, and we were just saying that's kind of unusual. Usually we kind of had that feel this time out, at least roughly what's going to happen. Having said that, I think at this time last year, we all thought that Will Levis was probably going second pick. So you just don't know this far out exactly what's going to happen. And I'm sure a lot's going to change before we actually get into the season.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really curious to see. I think another interesting thing around that 2nd pick is the addition of Kingsbury to the Commanders. Bringing that guy in for a reason. So he has to like one of these 3 guys. And I'm curious to see who they choose because he must be the favorite for him.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we are going to talk about all the fantasy relevant rookies coming in. We're going to look at basically which guys are going to impact your fantasy teams into this coming season, who should be drafting, where you should be drafting them, what teams we want to see them going to, and also how it's going to impact the other players. So let's get started with the most obvious guy, I think, Caleb Williams. Now, we know he's near definitely going to the Bears. It would be a real shock if he ended up somewhere else. He's the consensus number 1 pick. They've had meeting after meeting with him. He seems to think he's going there. He's rejecting a lot of other meetings and opportunities to work out and things like that. I mean, he's confident. There's no doubt about that. But the question is he the guy for the Bears? And what impact is this going to have? Does he have to be the first quarterback off the board for you?
Yeah, I think for the Bears, they got to take him. He's kind of one of those generational talents that you don't see very often. They moved on from Justin Fields, so it's pretty clear this is their guy. If it wasn't their guy, I think there'd be a lot more rumors, a little more buzz about other players sneaking into there, but we're not hearing that. So I think it's a clear consensus that he's going to the Bears. And then from a fantasy perspective, he might be going into one of the best situations that a number 1 pick will be going into, with having a receiver core of DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett. They brought in DeAndre Swift for a running back. That's pretty good. That's not normally a the first team picking. They don't have skill position players like that. So from a fantasy perspective, it's even better. I don't want to say he could be CJ Stroud, but he could be putting up that or Joe Burrow kind of type rookie numbers with these options.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is a fantastic opportunity. This is definitely the landing spot for fantasy that you want to be hitting if you're a quarterback. You've got all those options. Plus, with the number 9 pick, they could easily add another weapon. They could add a Rome Odunze. They could add Brock Bowers. They probably won't, but they could. So there's a heap of different possibilities for extra players they could bring in. Plus, they could draft a running back as well. We don't know what's going to happen later in the draft. So even before the drafts happened, there's so many weapons there, which makes it really interesting for them. When it comes to dynasty leagues and rookie drafts, when you're talking about Superflex, do we think that Caleb Williams is the guy that's going first off the board? Or we've got a lot of good wide receivers here. Is Caleb Williams just the number 1 pick in every single draft we do going into this season if it's a rookie draft?
Yeah, that's a good question. I want to say yes, but it depends on those other receivers land, because where they land may not be the best value for them. But with what I also like about the Bears is that they're going to be playing against the Packers and the Lions that put up points. So he's going to have to put up points to stay, toe to toe with those offenses. And then even with the Vikings, they may sneak up and get a quarterback. I wouldn't discount. I know Kirk Cousins left, but don't discount the Vikings either. So he'll be going to a division playing against division foes that are going to be putting a lot of points. So I think he should be the first, pick as well.
Yeah, I agree. They can no longer just grind out wins. They're going to have to start scoring points. So I think they've recognized that, and I think that putting all the weapons in place, they definitely seem the most prepared to take their franchise quarterback of all the teams coming up. So I think it looks really good for Caleb Williams. In a super flex draft, I think it's really just going to depend on your needs. There are going to be people that are really hot at quarterback but have nothing else, and then you can start talking about Marvin Harrison and guys like that. But I think in most super flex drafts, we're going to be seeing Caleb Williams go first in a rookie draft. Okay, let's move on to the next guy. And the favorite for the second pick at the moment is Jaden Daniels, but it's still very much in flux. That's really changed over the last week or two. I think most people thought this was probably going to be Drake May initially, and then it slowly started to drift towards Jaden Daniels. And every day when I wake up and check the odds are moving more towards the Commanders. By the way, the odds you're seeing on the screen are via DraftKings. Other websites have things a little bit differently. Plus, the odds for the lower teams are a little bit higher than they should be because they're never going to offer really good odds on things that are unlikely to happen, so it doesn't affect their liability too much. But Commanders are considered the favorite. Could go to the Patriots. Not out of the question someone will jump up, or he could fall to the fourth pick. But for me, he's probably the second option off the board. I think he won't get past pick 3. And for me, I think he's more of a fantasy weapon. He's got his legs. He's very, very careful with the ball, probably too careful with the ball. Which means he's not going to throw interceptions. So depending on your scoring system, he could be someone that's going to be really useful for fantasy. What's your thoughts on Jaden Daniels?
No, I have him right here too. I see a lot of, May going too, and I don't see it though. So being a former Red Raider myself and following Kingsbury and the kind of quarterbacks he likes, this kind of fits what he likes to do. This is the kind of player that just going to come in and I think immediately be successful in a Kingsbury-led offense. They've got some decent, weapons on the outside with Terry McLaurin. They brought in Zach Ertz, who used to play with Kingsbury in Arizona, who he traded for from Philly. So I think there's going to be some familiarity with the offense. They have Dotson still there, but I think he'll be able to fit in real nicely with Kingsbury and that Commanders offense.
Yeah, I think the Commanders is the spot that you want him going to. I think they're going to be able to make this work. I think with Cliff Kingsbury there, that's really useful as well. I just feel like this offense is set up for a guy who can start to grow. I think they had their growing pains a little bit with Sam Howell last year. I think they can kind of develop into something a little bit better. They're probably a couple of years off still from being a real contender, but at least you've got a reasonably good defense to give you a chance to win games. Plus, you've got enough offensive pieces in place that you can kind of make it work. But I do think that this is going to be a situation where if he goes to the Commanders, and I think he probably will, it's going to be probably a couple of years before he really starts to be the guy that we can rely on. Now, the real question is, in rookie leagues, if he goes to the Commanders or if he goes to the Patriots, how does that affect how you draft him compared to someone like a Drake May or a JJ McCarthy? Is he going to be the second guy quarterback off the board for you?
Yeah, I think so. I think he has to be. I think from a historical perspective, when Kingsbury, I know he was the head coach in Arizona, but when he had Kyler Murray in 19, he had the 8th most points for a quarterback that season. That's a rookie, the 8th most points. That's really good. That's a starter in 10-man leagues, well, maybe in redraft and Dynasty. So you put that in perspective. That's a guy that's going to help you win right away. Not saying it's Kyler Murray by any means, though, but there's potential that he could be a top 15 quarterback for fantasy year one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want a guy, on my team that has that kind of potential and ceiling.
You want that upside, and I feel like he's got the like the Lamar Jackson style athleticism. He's not the same quality of runner as a Lamar Jackson, but we've seen how much Lamar can do with his legs. We've even seen guys like Josh Allen, and I think Jaden Daniels is more athletic than Josh Allen, do a lot with his legs, and that's what makes him so dangerous for fantasy. So I think having someone who's got that running ability, for me, he's closer to Caleb Williams than he is to the other guys. I think there are going to be situations in the next few years where we could easily go back and think, wow, we really should have taken Jaden Daniels as the first quarterback off the board because of that athletic ability. It's just a lot riskier than a Caleb Williams, where he's so well set up, Caleb Williams at Chicago, to succeed. Whereas with Jaden Daniels, he doesn't quite have that same level of weapons around him.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Let's talk about the third guy off the board, someone who we kind of expected to initially go second. He started to fall a little bit. And I think there's even an argument that he could potentially fall behind JJ McCarthy. Now, there are still some people in Washington that like him. We're getting some really conflicting reports. There's people in Washington that like Drake May, people in Washington that like Jaden Daniels, And we're hearing a lot about even JJ McCarthy being an option for Washington, which seems crazy to me, but at least it's in the conversation. So Drake May is someone whose landing spot is still very much in flux. I think the Patriots is the most likely spot for him at the moment, and that's what DraftKings says as well. But he could easily still go to the Commanders, and it's possible he drops to 4 or even further. It's possible he gets all the way down to the Giants, potentially. I think if he gets to the Giants, they probably have to take him, but I'd be very surprised if he makes it past that 4-5 area. I think we're expecting the Vikings to come up and do something. So we'll have to wait and see exactly where he ends up. But the question is, what does that mean for you? What do you see happening with Drake May?
Yeah, I mean, the Patriots are going to be in a weird spot. Everyone he's got the intangibles, and he has the arm strength that people are really like, that he could be, a great starter in the NFL, which he could very well be. From a fantasy perspective, if he goes there to New England, I'm just not that excited about it. I mean, KJ Osborne, Kendrick Bourne, Hunter Henry. I know they got Ramondre Stevenson, but it's a new team, new coaching staff. We've never seen what this offense is going to look like after the Bill Belichick era. I'm just not buying. I'm kind of shying away from him, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have to agree. I don't have a problem with Drake May, the player. I think he's still got a little bit of learning to do. And the Patriots still have a lot of developing to do. Like, it's great that they've gone to Jared Mayer. I think he's going to be interesting. I think he might do a good job, but he's probably going to be a defensive-minded coach. We don't know that for sure, but that's his background. You'd expect him to go in that direction. You'd expect he's going to have a lot of low-scoring games. I don't think he's going to let Drake May really air it out. Yeah. At least initially anyway. And there's no weapons for him to throw to anyway at the moment. So it's hard to see him really being a player that you can rely on. The other issue, of course, is he doesn't have that same athleticism as a Williams or a Daniels. He's good. He can use his legs kind of in that Daniel Jones, Jared Goff kind of area where they're fine quarterbacks. If you put them in the right system, they can run when they need to run, but realistically, they're not going to be using a whole lot of designed quarterback runs with him, and that's going to limit his value compared to the other guys. I guess my question for you is, if Drake May goes to the Commanders and Jaden Daniels goes to the Patriots, who would you have higher then?
See, that's interesting. Fantasy now is, if you can run the ball consistently as a quarterback and get those extra 30, 40, 50 yards a game, that just puts them on a different level because everybody's passing now. Not too long ago, people weren't throwing the ball 40 times a game. That's the norm now in the NFL. So if I can add the rushing aspect to my quarterback, that's going to increase point potential. So I think I would take Jaden Daniels. I mean, I know it's crazy. Still, no matter where he goes, I think his talent, his ability just puts him a little bit in a position to give you more points in fantasy. I think May is a project player. I don't think he's a day one from fantasy, at least. And even in the NFL, I don't know day one he's going to be a 500 football player, unfortunately. I don't know. So I might eat my words here. Middle of the season next year, be like, man, I was way off. But I just think he could be a project-style quarterback, which is not a bad thing in the NFL, but year 2, year 3, where he might shine. I don't think year 1 he's the guy you want.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm taking Jaden Daniels regardless of where he lies. Although if Daniels does go to the Patriots and May goes to the Commanders, I'm putting Daniels quite a bit below Caleb Williams. I think that does cause a real drop in his value. And I agree, Drake May is not someone that I would want to rely on in the first year or two. I wouldn't be surprised if he's not even starting in the first half of the season, if he's one of those players that kind of sits behind Jacoby Brissett or whoever is the starter where he is. And waits for a little while behind Sam Darnold if he goes to the Vikings. I think that makes a little bit of sense. Now, the real riser in this draft process has been JJ McCarthy. I think he was generally considered to be the clear fourth option, maybe even fifth option. According to some teams, they still have him as the fifth option, but he has been really rising. It's hard to know how much of that is just public perception, how much of that is the coaches, but it does seem to be that we are in the part of the process where a lot more of the coaches get involved, and they seem to love JJ McCarthy. They seem to like what he can add to the team. They seem to like the success that he's had. I don't know how much of that was down to him. To me, he strikes me as very much a system quarterback, an Alex Smith type. Now, to be fair, there's nothing wrong with Alex Smith. He went first pick and he had a very successful NFL career, all things considered. But I don't think he's what you're looking for. To me, he's a big step down from those top three guys. And I'm not exactly sure where he's going to end up, which makes it a little bit scary as well. The odds are high that the Vikings try to get up and get a guy. Where they go to, we don't know, and who they pick. Well, it's just going to have to be whoever the fourth guy left is, unless they can convince the Patriots to move back, which I don't think is going to happen. So if he goes to the Vikings, at least they've got some weapons in place. What's your feeling on JJ McCarthy?
Yeah, he's kind of like a conundrum for me because, like you said, that system kind of quarterback feel to him. It's a great player, played at Michigan, played in big games. He seems more like a gamer than like a fantasy guy. So like what I mean by that is he's a guy that's going to win you games in real life. But in real life doesn't always translate to fantasy. And I think sometimes we fail to see that sometimes. Like, oh, this guy's going to be great. And, he just could be 250 every game and 1 to 2 touchdowns. Not going to win you weeks, not going to lose you weeks in fantasy, though, but he's going to be a solid contributor all aboard. And so I can see why teams want a guy like that because he's a winner. You want a winning mindset, a winning player to lead your team. So if he does go to Minnesota, I think that's really interesting just based on if he's going to be molded to what they want to do up there with Jefferson because he's a superstar talent. So he alone rises McCarthy stock if he goes there. So I'm really curious to see if the Vikings jump up, where they jump up to go get him amongst other quarterbacks. There's another guy I like a little bit later in the draft.
Interesting. So I agree with you. I think if he goes to Minnesota, that's going to be really interesting. Justin Jefferson and he could combine well. He's pretty good outside the numbers. He's pretty good at throwing towards the sidelines, which I feel like could make things very interesting for Jefferson. But Jefferson's good all over the field, so he'll make it work with whoever he ends up with. It's just whether he goes to a situation where they're going to let him throw the ball. I don't know that if he went to Minnesota, I'd want him throwing the ball for over 300 yards like Kirk Cousins. I agree with what you said. I think he needs to be in a system where he's throwing for 200, 250 and getting wins rather than a situation where they're expecting him to make a lot of risky throws because he will turn the ball over, especially compared to a Jaden Daniels or a Caleb Williams. And I'm not sure that's exactly what you want in those situations. But having said that, when you come from Kirk Cousins, who's really quite risky and aggressive with the ball, maybe they're just hoping he can turn into that sort of situation. I think it's more likely that we see a Will Levis sort of situation where he's a guy who needs to sit and develop and may or may not turn into anything. There is a chance he goes to the Commanders, though. And if that happens, I think it makes it a little bit more interesting. If we see him go to the Commanders, would you put him ahead of Drake May?
That would mean May is not in the top 3 then.
Yeah. I don't know where that means May would be, which makes it interesting.
See, that's an interesting question because if that happens, then where does he fall to? Other quarterback needy teams, outside that, Vikings, the Broncos, Raiders, Seahawks. Now, what could be really crazy is if the Rams were to trade up to get a Drake May kind of guy to let him sit. A la, Jordan Love, Pat Mahomes, jersey you're rocking, the former Red Raider. Love to see that. A guy like that going to a team and learning behind a veteran, and in a good system, if Drake May goes with the Rams, for Dynasty, I would want stock in that, because you got McVay, you got Puka. That's just a really good system. It's a very quarterback-friendly system. Has been with McVay, will be for a long time. So if he goes there, it's really interesting. Now, if he goes with the Broncos or Raiders, or maybe the Giants even, I think I would still take May over McCarthy still, because I don't know what that means. I don't know in a Kingsbury offense what he would ask of McCarthy to do.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think that May would win out by going to one of those lower teams. There's a reason why they're lower down the draft order. It's because they're better teams already. Mm-hmm. So I feel like actually avoiding both Washington and New England is a little bit of a weird sort of win for Drake May, even though I think it's likely he still goes in the top 3. Okay, let's talk about a couple of the other options. So odds-wise, Bo Nix is next up, but Michael Penix is really been rising, so it wouldn't surprise me at all if Bo Nix ends up being the 6th quarterback off the board. Having said that, there are still some people in teams that think that Bo Nix is better than JJ McCarthy. He's much older than a lot of the other quarterbacks. He's got a lot more experience. He's a very safe option. He's another guy that you could use as a system quarterback. The Broncos are the heavy favorites to take him because he is that sort of Sean Payton kind of guy. I think he sees, this guy could be Drew Brees or someone like that. I don't know that he quite has that upside, but he's an interesting option. I think it will really depend on where he goes. He may not even go in the first round, or he may go within the first 12 picks. It could go anywhere. What are your thoughts on Bo Nix?
Yeah, I actually like Bo Nix a lot. I think he's one of those sneaky kind of players that isn't getting a lot of buzz, but I think if he goes with the Broncos, I love that fit for him there with Sean Payton there. He had the highest completion percentage in NCAA history. He's smart with the ball. He knows where he wants to go. I know they threw a lot of screen passes and quick passes in Oregon, though, but that's the kind of offense that Peyton likes to do when he was in New Orleans. And obviously, Russell Wilson didn't fit his system, and he said, see ya. So whoever Sean Payton brings in, this is the guy he feels is going to fit his system and do what he wants to do offensively. And he's got a great track record, so why bet against that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think where he goes will tell us the way the teams view him. I think if we see him go on day one, that means they see him as a starter who they can go forward with straight away. If he starts to fall a little bit and we see him going in the 2nd or 3rd round, I think that's really giving us an indication that teams see him as a guy that's probably more of a upside backup that they need to sit behind someone and kind of develop into something. Having said that, for me, compared to a Penix or a McCarthy, I think he's a little bit more ready to go right now. I just think his upside is a little bit capped compared to a lot of those other guys. So it's going to be very interesting to see who drafts him and how they're going to use him, though I think he is significantly less exciting for fantasy than a couple of these other guys.
I'd agree with that one too.
Now, Michael Penix is the guy that's kind of been drifting towards him, and some would say past him, depending on which bookmakers you look at. There's a lot of question marks here. There's a lot of injury risk. He's been injured a lot, but coaches love him. There's a lot of upside there. It's easily possible he goes ahead of Bo Nix. It's not impossible he goes ahead of JJ McCarthy, though I think that would be considered surprising. The odds of him going to any of those within the top 5 picks is pretty low. He's mocked to the Raiders a lot of the time. I think that's possible, but unlikely, given they already have Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew. I don't know why they'd have done that if they're going to bring in a guy who can start straight away. I think they're more likely to do a Hendon Hooker style situation and bring in a guy who can properly sit behind those guys and learn if they're going to do anything. Whereas I think that Penix is probably going to go either day 1 or very early day 2. To one of the teams that didn't get a quarterback the first time around. There's not that many other teams that desperately need quarterbacks, so they'd go in the first round. So whichever team takes him can probably let him drift a little bit and take him later on. What are your thoughts on Michael Penix? Is he a guy that we could see in the first round, and what about for fantasy?
Yeah, he's another very interesting guy, very successful at Washington. I don't feel like he doesn't have an obvious home in this draft. It was the way the draft is just set up this year. I think he's more likely a day 2 pick. I could see the Giants. Who knows with Daniel Jones, what they're doing there. There's a lot of buzz about what they're doing or not doing with him still. I'm sure Bob hates to hear that, but that's the reality of it. I think a place that makes a lot of sense just geographically would be the Seahawks. I know they have Geno there, but he could at least sit for a year or two behind Geno, maybe staying in Washington. It could be a good feel-good story. Sometimes those things just happen to be the way the things shake out. And if you go to Seattle, I think that's a good spot for a dynasty because I don't know if they're still going to be running 3 receiver sets, but they've got 3 pretty good receivers right now. So when you talk about going into a team with weapons, they have the weapons. And if Geno were to get hurt, he could step right in.
Yeah, I agree. The Seahawks are a really interesting one where their O-line and D-line really need to work. So I can't imagine them taking a quarterback in the first round, but I could easily see them taking a shot on someone on day 2. And I think Penix could be a guy that they'd be very interested in. He could grow behind Geno and develop into something. I think regardless, the Seahawks aren't going to take someone to start straight away. And I think that brings a Penix into the conversation. And I think it brings in a couple of the lower down guys like your Spencer Rattlers and people like that as well. But yeah, I agree. Seahawks would be fantastic for Penix. I'd love to see that. And it is the 3rd most likely destination for him. But I think there's plenty of other places he could go. There's no real consensus landing spot for him, as you said. Okay, let's get into the wide receivers. Now, there's a lot of good wide receivers in this class. For me, the quarterbacks is interesting. The top 3 quarterbacks are all probably the best 3 quarterbacks we've seen since Trevor Lawrence, probably in 2021. The wide receivers, these are the best guys we've seen since AJ Green, since Calvin Johnson. We're going back a long way to find prospects that are this good. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be that good in the NFL. I'm talking about how we view them as they enter the draft. We're viewing them as prospects that are that good. They're among the best prospects we've seen. And that gives them a really high ceiling and a pretty high floor as well, because guys like that very rarely bust when it comes to wide receivers. Marvin Harrison, really, he's got to go in the top 5. It would be absolutely crazy if he didn't. The only question mark is if someone comes in to get JJ McCarthy or Drake May, and where does that see him fall? So I think he probably goes to the Cardinals. I think the Cardinals at 4 does make sense. But if someone trades with the Cardinals, then he'll go to the Chargers, or someone else could jump up to the Chargers if the Chargers decide they want to go O-line instead. The question is, what does that mean for fantasy for him? So what's your thoughts on Marvin Harrison Jr.?
Yeah, so if he goes with the Cardinals, that's really good for his fantasy prospects. The Cardinals have no wide receivers in that room. They do target the tight end the most. I think they were number 1 or number 2 are tied for first for tight end targets a season ago with the new regime. So they may continue with that path, but he goes in there. He has Kyler Murray, former number 1 player. He probably settles in real nicely there. However, I do think the Cardinals will trade out of this spot of all the teams. Cardinals need a lot of help from a lot of different positions. So they can use a lot of players at any position. So I could see them trading back and then coming back into the top 10. I have an article that released last week where I mentioned this. And I actually had Marvin Harrison going to the Giants, him actually falling. Just the way trades happen, players fell. One number 5 spot was probably a little bit of a bold statement, but so I could see him fall into the Giants, and the Giants getting their number 1 man for Daniel Jones, and then that could revitalize the Giants offensively.
That would be very interesting if you went to the Giants. I think he's the kind of alpha that they need there. They've got a whole heap of just like small move guys, and I feel like they need just a guy who can be their alpha receiver, and I think he is probably the guy to do that. I in my latest mock had a team going back as well, but I had the Chargers going back, then coming back into the top 10 as well, because I just think it's hard to see the Cardinals passing on Harrison. There have been reports which suggest that even if they were at pick 2 or 3, they were going to take a wide receiver. I think here they kind of need to do it. The only possibility, I guess, is if they trade back and then trade back in to get a Roma Dunze or something like that, or alternatively trade back to get assets and then take a wide receiver later on in the draft. I think those are both reasonable options. When it comes to a Marvin Harrison versus a Caleb Williams, obviously in one quarterback league, you're always taking Marvin Harrison. Would you take him ahead of Caleb Williams in a super flex league? And if so, in what situations?
I think I would still take Caleb just based on the setup for the Bears. But you can make the case, though, for Marvin Harrison. If he does end up with the Cardinals, even a different team, it's also your roster construction in a dynasty format. So depending on who you have or don't have, what you lack, I think you could make the case to take him because he's also one of these generational talents that doesn't come very often. So when they have a ceiling as they do, you kind of just got to go with it and hope for the best.
Yeah, totally agree. I feel like he's the kind of guy who it depends on what you need. If you need a wide receiver or a flex guy, then you are going to take Marvin Harrison. But if you even slightly need a quarterback, you'd be crazy to pass on Caleb Williams. Now, speaking of passing on Marvin Harrison, there's a surprising amount of people that think that Malik Neighbors could go ahead of Marvin Harrison. I've seen some very smart people even mocking him ahead of Marvin Harrison, which is really interesting to me. But I think that the media buzz on Marvin Harrison is a little bit stronger than the actual league buzz on Marvin Harrison. I think that most teams, in fact, see Harrison and Neighbors as being reasonably close. Now, there's not a lot that I'm aware of that think Neighbors is significantly better than Harrison, but they are considered to be a very close number one and number two, even though the consensus is that he's still the wide receiver two, Malik Neighbors. He's a long way ahead of Rome Odunze, though, and I could see a situation where he goes higher than most people expect. His main landing spots are going to be around the Giants or Chargers, but it is possible another team jumps up to get him, or one of those top teams falls back in a trade and ends up taking him instead. He's a guy that's still an elite talent. I know we talk about Marvin Harrison Jr. as being one of the best guys we've seen coming out in years. Malik Neighbors is as well. He's a legit top 5 option. He's one of the best wide receivers we've seen in a long time. If it wasn't for Marvin Harrison Jr., I feel like we'd be getting a lot more buzz about just how good Malik Neighbors is. He's a real talent, and he's somebody that is going to make a big difference in Dynasty and in the NFL moving forward. What are your thoughts on the LSU guy?
Yeah, no, he's right there up there. I mean, he helped with Jaden Daniels and that offense at LSU do what they do, and they're both regarded as number 1 or 2 in their respective positions. Both going to go potentially maybe in the top 5, at least for sure the top 10, and 2 players in the same team. Yeah, I think the NFL GMs want a piece of these LSU players, and LSU has a track record of providing just talented wide receivers. So he could easily go above Marvin Harrison. I don't think he does. I do think he is like, if he does, so like on my article, if like trades happen, it's so hard to predict where some of these guys are going to go. Now with the Diggs information, if him being traded to the Texans, the Bills have no receivers now. They have Josh Allen. They're still in a win mode now. The Bengals, if they trade T. Higgins somewhere, they need another receiver. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these teams do trade up. Now, which receiver, who knows? But there's so many good receivers in this draft, so that a lot of teams may trade up to acquire a receiver to pair with their quarterback because they're in a win now mode. But if he does go to the Giants, as the odds say, still a good fit. Daniel Jones is still a good quarterback. You pair him with Darren Waller, they're gonna put up some fantasy stats, I think.
Yeah, I feel like no matter where he lands, he's going to be pretty good. I'd love to see him go to the Chargers. I think him with Justin Herbert would be fantastic. The Chargers at the moment now, they've gotten rid of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, just have guys basically. I mean, Josh Palmer's fine. Quentin Johnston is bordering on a bust, but I don't know that you can take too much out of that first year. We knew he was going to be a guy who needed development. I think Malik Neighbors is a guy that can just immediately come in and make an impact. He's ready to go. He's an elite talent already. And so I feel like if he goes to the Chargers or the Giants, that's going to be interesting. It is interesting talking about guys who trade up or teams that trade up, because I was trying to think of which teams would trade up for our next guy. And it was a little bit difficult to work out who goes on that list. So we might as well move on to him now. So the number 3 guy is Rome Odunze. Realistically, he's kind of sitting at that spot where he probably falls into that Falcons-Bears area. He deserves to go in the top 10. He is a top talent. In many years, he would be the top wide receiver talent in the class. He just happens to be behind 2 real generational talents. He should go number 8 or 9, but that's currently the Falcons, who really don't need another weapon. They've gone like top offensive weapon with London and Bijan and Kyle Pitts. I can't imagine they do that again, even though that would be amazing. To the Bears, we talked about how great it would be to give Caleb Williams another weapon, but they've already got Keenan Allen and they've got DJ Moore. How many good receivers do you realistically need when you could be getting someone who can help flesh out another position? And that brings a lot of other teams in. I think the New York Jets is really interesting. We know they like him. It's kind of on record that they like going either Rome Odunze or Brock Bowers. And I think realistically, if he falls to 10, then he's going to go there. So that means if you're going to get him, you need to jump up to that 8 or 9 spot. I'm trying to think which teams would do it. You talked about the Bills and the Bengals. They'd have to move a long way. They're going to have to give up future first-round picks. That's a lot to go up and get a receiver. I think probably the next team below the Jets that would even consider it is maybe the Colts. They did just re-sign Michael Pittman. It's not really their style to have a whole lot of stud receivers, especially Anthony Richardson's a guy that's going to run more than throw the ball a lot. Mm-hmm. And I've got a good run game already with Jonathan Taylor. So I just don't see teams that are really going to be willing to go up and get Rome Odunze. I'd love to see it, though. Him with a stud quarterback would be absolutely amazing. He's so good with contested catches. He just needs a guy who's going to have the confidence to put the ball into those positions. I think it would be really interesting to see him with a Kirk Cousins, but I'd even think that Caleb Williams would be willing to do that. For that reason, I think somewhere like the Bears or the Jets would be fantastic landing spots to him. I think the Jets is probably the number 1 spot because he goes in as the wide receiver too. I think he's probably ahead of everyone else there. What are your thoughts on Rome Odunze? Where's he going to go? Where do we want to see him go? And what does it mean for fantasy?
Yeah, so I know the odds are low, but I could see the Cardinals trading out of that 4 spot and coming back and getting him. He's got that kind of talent, as you mentioned. He could be the number 1 receiver in any other drafts. So I think as the Cardinals look at that, can they get draft capital, come back up, still take him, and then get a defensive player, middle of the pack by trading out of the 4 spot? If he does go to the Bears from a fantasy perspective, I actually don't like it. He's going to have to be fighting for targets in that offense. And then with the Jets, I know he'll have Aaron Rodgers there, but you got Garrett Wilson. They just brought in Mike Williams as a rookie. He's still fighting for targets there as well. In Atlanta, same thing, fighting for targets. Super talented player, but he may not live up to the hype if he goes to a team where he has to really fight for targets. And in the name of fantasy, you want rookie receivers to get 12, 13 targets a game. He goes to those places, he might be capped at 6, 7 a game, and is going to have a home run play to have any kind of real impact right away in redraft and dynasty. You can play the long game with him, obviously, but I would prefer him to go to a team that needs a number 1 receiver like right away for him to be fantasy relevant.
Yeah, totally agree. It would be best for him, I think, if he goes to a Cardinals or a Chargers or a Giants. I think that's less likely, but I think it would be fantastic for him to immediately step in and be the alpha. Somewhere like the Bears, it's going to be a couple of years. Keenan Allen's going to have to leave before he starts getting a relative or a reasonable amount of targets. Now, there are a couple of other guys, wide receivers, that could go in the first round. In fact, there's a lot of possibilities that might go in the first round. I feel like the guy who's probably going to go number 4 is this guy, Brian Thomas, kind of once again behind Malik Neighbors in the pecking order and behind a couple of other guys. A lot of talent there, but a lot of downside as well. His hands are made of wood. He just can't seem to consistently catch the ball. He's a little bit lazy, especially with his route running and just in general. Not the same clear path to success that those top 3 guys have. Very love-hate across the lead. Could easily go in the top 10, but he could easily fall out of the first round as well. I think he's probably one of those parabolic players who could go anywhere. It really depends on what happens and which team falls in love with him. Because of his situation, there's no odds on DraftKings from where he's going to go. So there's just a couple of landing spots. For me, I most recently mocked him to the Bills, but I feel like that him falling to 28 is pretty unlikely. I think it's more likely the team either goes up to get him or alternatively just happens to go against need and take a guy that they feel can make a big difference for them. What are your thoughts on Brian Thomas?
Yeah, I think he slides in at like the early part of like the 20s. I think that's where we'll probably likely see him. The Bills obviously need receivers. The Chiefs, I don't know, with Rashid Rice, the whole situation now, that kind of puts them in a weird spot. I know they did go get Hollywood Brown, but they still need other receivers there. Kadarius Toney didn't work out, obviously. And so that's an interesting situation there. They're trying to three-peat. So Pat's got to throw to somebody. The Cowboys could be an interesting fit there. I know Brandon Cooks is there. Gallup's going to probably get released, more than likely, from the sounds of it. And McCarthy's in a win now mode with Dallas with Dak. They don't have running backs, so I guess they're going to pass 50 times a game. I don't know. So I think Brian Thomas will be a guy that goes into a very fantasy-friendly setup where he could be, a sneaky play in redraft leagues, just based on where he falls to. Because, again, I think he's going to go to a team that is already a winning team and a good offensive system. He's not going to be in a bad, with a rookie quarterback or a struggling offense. He'll be in I look at all these teams here. They're all pretty good offenses. Steelers, man, we'll see. But everybody else are pretty good offenses. So with the Ayuk situation, if he gets traded from 49ers, he fits in there. I don't know. He could just be a guy that's not getting a lot of hype, but is quietly a successful player in fantasy day one.
Yeah, I agree. The landing spots there are great compared to a lot of the other guys we've talked about, as long as he avoids the Carolina Panthers. And I think that's going to be a thing you hear occasionally with a lot of these later guys. If they avoid the Panthers, because the Panthers seem to be a death trap at the moment, realistically, I feel like he's going to have a lot of success no matter where he goes. Or at least he's going to have the opportunity for success. I feel like he does have some bust potential, but I feel like there's a lot of upside with a lot of those teams. I think it's also not impossible that whichever team trades with Minnesota, if that happens, if a team trades with Minnesota and then ends up not being able to get one of the top 3 wide receivers, I feel like that 23rd pick that will probably come with that is an opportunity to go get a wide receiver. I've heard reports that the Cardinals would consider trading down and then using one of their later picks to get a wide receiver. And I feel like if that's the case, that's where Brian Thomas could possibly fall into. And I think that would be a really interesting situation as well. So there's a lot of possibilities there for a lot of these later guys, just a question of where they end up landing. Another guy that's considered a first-round lock, which is a bit surprising to me personally. For me, there are only 4 real clear first-round guys, and even Thomas is a bit of a question mark. It's A.D. Mitchell. I don't really see it as much as a lot of other people do. There's a lot of issues there that I feel like teams have to pass through. And even though everyone seems to think that he's a consensus first rounder, I don't see it that way. He's good. He's talented, but there's medical issues, there's character issues. We don't very clearly know where he'd end up. There's not really a lot of teams that definitely need a first round wide receiver. It's a really deep wide receiver class. You can take one in the 2nd or 3rd round and feel really good about the player you're getting. I don't think that teams are going to be desperate to draft him, and that means that he could easily fall. Do you have any thoughts on A.D. Mitchell?
Yeah, I mean, he was a good player for Texas. He destroyed my Red Raiders, so it is what it is there. But yeah, I think he's more of a day 2. I think sometimes in fantasy we want to see all the sexy players, so to speak, get taken in the 1st round, but you still have to win football games, so you got to draft guys from the trenches. So I think he's a guy that falls out of the 1st round.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's on the borderline for that. As much as the odds suggest guaranteed 1st round, I really don't see it that way. I think he's the kind of guy that we could see falling. Having said that, whenever a player falls, when you've got the Baltimore Ravens there late on, the Ravens love taking players that have fallen. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's a couple of teams that will just soak up those value picks at the end of the 1st round. And we could see someone like Mitchell go very late in the 1st round to a team like the Chiefs or the 49ers or the Ravens. Now, if you're interested in more wide receiver stuff, I also have an article coming out tomorrow on the Razzball website where I talk about the likely landing spots. And I go into a lot more detail about what type of players these guys are. Are they the speed guys? Are they the big touchdown monsters? If you're interested in wanting to know what sort of players to expect from these wide receivers, check out the Razzball website. My article is coming out tomorrow. Now, Let's move on to the tight end in this draft. There's realistically really only one guy. It's Brock Bowers. Everyone else will probably not go until the third round, maybe. I think that's probably when we see guys like Sanders and Mello off the board. Bowers is the guy. And we've had a lot of good tight ends in the last few years. Last year's tight end class was realistically, I think I went into the draft saying it was one of the best tight end classes we've seen ever. And it turned out to be that Sam Laporta was the guy that became a massive weapon from that. But there were realistically 3 or 4 good tight ends. Because of that depth, though, in last year's class, we ended up seeing a lot of the tight ends drift into the second round. This year, that's not going to happen. There is just one tight end. If you want a tight end, you have to draft Brock Bowers. And I forgot to take the 10 off next to his name because I think he's going to go to the Jets. I think realistically, the only situation where he doesn't go to the Jets is if they somehow end up with Rome Odunze. So for that reason, I feel like this is a good landing spot for them. He probably becomes their second best receiving weapon. He's a very good receiving guy. He's a little bit small for a tight end, so the blocking is a bit of a question mark. But for fantasy, we don't care about that if he's out there running routes the whole time. The only risk is if the teams can't trust him to block, are they taking him off the field for those first and second downs and limiting his opportunity to audible into routes and get targets that way? So there's a small amount of risk that way, but I feel like the situation where he probably goes to the Jets, could go to the Colts. If he doesn't go to one of those teams, it's just going to be some random other team that we didn't expect who couldn't pass up on the value because there is so much quality there. I originally was mocking him to the Chargers at 5. That's how good he is considered around the league. But I feel like with these wide receivers and other options there, that's probably not going to happen at this stage. What do we think about Brock Bowers? How does he fit in? And is he a guy that we're taking as our kind of, after those top 3 wide receivers in rookie drafts?
Yeah, no, I think so. In my article that I wrote, I had Bowers going to the Chargers, actually, myself, for one of my bold takes. Reason being is that Greg Roman is there now, the OC. He was there with Harbaugh in San Francisco when they had Vernon Davis. Now he went to Baltimore. I guess we had there Mark Andrews. So I think the Chargers take him. He fits the need immediately. They have no tight end there. And he's a mainstay of that offense for years to come. And yeah, I just think a lot of good things will come out of it.
Yeah, totally agree. I think he goes to the Chargers, he goes to the Jets, things are going to be good. If he goes to the Colts, I think that's going to be really interesting. They realistically don't have a lot of other weapons. I think all of those landing spots would be pretty great. The Bengals were a place I had Sam Laporta going to last year in my final mock. If he goes there, that would be fantastic for them. Firstly, because it means he's somehow fallen to the 18th pick or they've traded up. But secondly, because he gets Joe Burrow, and I feel like especially if T. Higgins eventually leaves, suddenly he could become the second receiving option there. I feel like there's a lot of value in a lot of those teams based on the number of targets that could be up for grabs. Now, for the rest of these guys, we're just going to, I won't say quick fire, but we're certainly going to go through it in a little bit less detail. There's no running backs that are likely to go in the first round. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if no running backs go in the second round. I've ordered those guys based on the odds of being the first running back off the board. I still personally think that Blake Corum could easily be the first running back off the board, but the bookmakers have it as Trey Benson and Jonathan Woods are the favorites, and they've also got Jalen Wright and Marshall Lloyd in there as well. There's a solid amount of talent, but running backs have definitely drifted in value more recently. I think teams have recognized that it's not the best way to spend your draft assets on a guy that realistically is probably going to leave after 5 years or so, as opposed to another player that could be a true franchise player. Where do you see the running backs? Who's your favorite guy? What are the best landing spots for you?
I'm really not sure on running backs. The way this free agency went down with running backs, I think that's the telltale sign of how GMs are valuing running backs now. I think we might see one round 2 maybe, but I wouldn't be surprised if we just start seeing, running backs, a lot of them go in the 3rd round now because they play for a few years and then they don't want to pay them anymore now. When you pay a running back, all the wear and tear, it's an investment. And I feel bad for these young men, they work hard to play in the NFL, but it's a business at the end of the day. So I think a lot of these guys will probably go around 2 and 3, just kind of where a lot of guys signed and just team needs. I think whoever the Cowboys get, that is going to be the number one running back that I foresee for fantasy.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Cowboys is the best spot that we want to see teams landing. I think the Chargers are interesting, especially because Blake Corum played with Harbaugh at Michigan. So realistically, I think a lot of people are joining those dots. That's certainly the probabilistically the most likely landing spot according to odds makers. But I think the Cowboys, if they get a Benson, if they get a Brooks, that would be unbelievable. That's going to really vault that guy up your rookie boards, and you can start thinking about taking them around the Brock Bowers area of that fifth or sixth pick in a rookie draft, or if it's super flex league, that kind of 7th, 8th, 9th pick. I think that's going to be really interesting. But yeah, I agree with you. There's no names that really jump out. There's no Bijan in this class. There's no Jahmyr Gibbs. It's a significantly weaker class than usual. And there's realistically a lot less conversation on it simply because there's not much to talk about. It's really hard to know exactly who's going to go where. We're just going to have to wait and see. There's one of them probably going to end up at the Panthers, for example, and that's immediately going to be a big red flag for me. There's a whole heap of landing spots for these guys that would be terrible news. There's a lot of news. There's a lot of talk that the Bears want to take a running back to pair with DeAndre Swift. We've seen that done. And we've even heard talk that the Eagles want to take a running back to pair with Saquon Barkley, which would just be terrible for both of them, for example. Yeah. So we're going to see some weird landing spots like when we saw the Lions take Gibbs. I know a lot of people went, well, that's absolutely crazy. And yet that's what I mocked in my final draft because there were a lot of rumors to suggest that's going to happen. And there are once again rumors of teams that are going to take running backs in the 3rd or 4th round that already have an established running back and they're trying to transition the job across. So it could get really ugly for fantasy with running backs. We'll have to wait and see what happens. As for the wide receivers, well, there's a lot more other good wide receivers around. This is a really good, deep wide receiver class. It's a great class for wide receivers. It's great. It's actually a pretty deep class for cornerbacks, and it's an excellent class for offensive linemen. But wide receivers is obviously the one that makes the most sense for fantasy. Here's some of my favorite guys, or at least some of the guys that are most likely to go either end of the 1st round or more likely early on day 2. Any names there that jump out to you guys that you'd like to see end up in a good landing spot?
I'm not as familiar with a lot of the day 2, 3 receivers, unfortunately. There's one receiver that I've seen a lot of good things about. He's not a day 2 or day 3 guy. He could be. He was at UCF. I can't think of his name. It just eludes me right now. But I really liked him. He made a lot of good grabs at UCF, and he makes catches look really easy. I know I said this in a previous podcast, but I really liked him. And video, I watch Steve Smith and Javon Baker is his name. Sorry, there he goes. And really liked him. He's not one of these guys that's on this list here, though, but I think he's a guy who'll go to a good place and he can make an immediate impact on teams. But a lot of these guys, it's just so hard. It just depends where they land. And then just kind of who their quarterback is. It's just so hard when you get to day 2, day 3, because it's really a crapshoot.
Yeah, I agree. I think with most of these guys, we just can't say at all what to expect from them. I think there's a couple of interesting later names as well. Jacob Cowing, you'll hear a little bit. Jermaine Burton's an interesting one. He's someone that would definitely be in a 1st rounder, but he's nuts. Like, there's so many character issues there. Constantly has caused trouble wherever he's gone. Some team's going to take him, and whether they can harness that talent and turn it into something productive is going to be really interesting. If they can, he's going to be a real value pick. He's someone that I'm probably going to take in quite a few dynasty drafts, no matter where he lands, simply because the upside's so high, and a lot of people are just going to see the low draft value and assume that means he's not very good. Of these guys here, I think there's a real mix. Xavier Legette is a guy that I absolutely love. I had him in college fantasy last year. He was spectacular. He's not as tall as some of the other guys like Dunze. He's not even as tall as Marvin Harrison Jr., but he plays massive. He looks huge on the field because he's so strong. He's so aggressive. He's so positive. He's good with contested balls, and he's very, very fast as well. I don't know that he's going to go in the first round, even though I regularly mock him there. More of a my love for him situation, but he'll go early in the second round. And as long as he avoids the Carolina Panthers and maybe the Patriots, I think he's going to be a fantastic value. So he's a guy that I really like. Xavier Worthy's a speed guy. Would not surprise me if he ends up at the Dolphins. That he's that kind of player. He's a real speed machine. Keon Coleman was getting a lot of first-round buzz. He's someone that started to fall now. But he is still a good player, and it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up in a pretty good situation. Then you've got guys like Ricky Pearsall and Ladd McConkey who aren't going to be stud receivers. They're more going to be like the second receivers on their team or the slot guys who can be very productive there. Not as useful for fantasy, but very good for actual football. So I think that's going to be very interesting as well. Cool. Is there anything else any other players you wanted to highlight or anything else fantasy-wise you wanted to highlight before we wrap things up?
I think we covered everybody for the most part. I think my favorite guy is going to be Brock Bowers. I'm really curious to see where he goes. I'm hoping it's the Chargers.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be really interesting to see a lot of these guys and their landing spots. And I feel like once they've landed, then we can start to really think about what impact this is going to have on fantasy. But guys like Bowers is going to be great if you need a tight end. There's so many good wide receivers here that I feel like if you're in a situation where you need good wide receivers for your dynasty team, there's not only those top three guys, there's so much depth that everyone's going to have a lot of good wide receivers. And it's also going to mean that a lot of the veteran wide receivers who are currently in those situations could find themselves further down the pecking order than we expected because their team was able to get a really talented player far later in the draft than they would usually be able to. And I think that's actually going to reduce the value of those sort of mid-range wide receivers compared to what we would usually see. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Razzball show. Thank you, Jeff, for joining me. Jeff, what should we expect for you coming up? Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm at Jefferson__21 on X. I'll have another article coming out next Monday talking more about the draft predictions, what to expect moving forward from a fantasy realm. And thanks for having me on. It's always a blast.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I've enjoyed it. Of course, you can find me at the Fantasy First Down on Instagram or at Fantasy First Down with no O on X. And of course, you can read both of our articles on the Razzball website. Make sure you check out the Razzball YouTube. There's a heap of other stuff on there. Check out the Razzball website for lots of articles and stuff like that. We'll be doing more stuff coming up to the draft. I'll be going through my latest mock draft later in the week as well, so we can talk about the non-fantasy related players as well. But for now, we are out of here. Have a good one.